The galaxy gathered as a tribunal ringed a dead star, and Alex Mercer knelt under the cold glare of 1,000 vessels. The chamber thrummed like a heart that had forgotten kindness and remembered only law. Magistrate Solaris Voss said, "Sentence is prepared." Data spires unfolded, projecting centuries of fire as if memory were a weapon. Commander Evelyn Drake said, "Compliance preserves a fragment." Dr. Marcus Hale said, "History demands correction." Alex bowed his head, tasting iron, and refused to beg, because dignity was all that remained. A whisper moved through the shadows, as if pity feared to be seen. Councillor Lyora Saren said, "They are not just judging you, they are judging us all." Solaris Voss said, "Verdict, extinction." Alex breathed once and felt a billion eyes press down, and somewhere far away a child's laugh died into silence. The escorts led Alex through corridors veined with cold light, as the crowd's roar faded into a pressure behind the ribs. The narrator counted the beats of restraint and found each step an oath not yet spoken. A courier drone hovered, sampling sweat, as if fear were evidence worth bottling. Commander Evelyn Drake said, "Consequences required discipline." Dr. Marcus Hale said, "Clarity arrives after pain." Alex lifted his chin and thought of a child's laugh sliced from memory like a page torn from a book. Solaris Voss said, "Humanity sees only its echo and calls it truth." Lyora Saren watched from a doorway, and her silence spoke the language of buried warnings. Alex said, "If judgment is a mirror, then show it to yourselves." The holding cell was a chapel of angles where light arrived wounded and left in pieces. The narrator traced the seams, and each seam whispered a species that had knelt here before. A recorder pearl sat in the corner like a patient eye. Alex said, "You can watch breath but not resolve." Solaris Voss said, "Resolve is a spark, vacuum eats sparks." Marcus Hale said, "History ends kinder if it ends quickly." Evelyn Drake said, "Accept lesser loss." Alex closed his eyes and pictured the dead star above, and the fleets that mistook silence for peace. Lyora Saren said, "Live through the night, and the dawn may speak." They paraded evidence like relics, and the chamber praised its own certainty. The narrator watched clips, sculpted by careful knives until truth bled into theater. Solaris Voss said, "Observe the arc from spark to conflagration." Marcus Hale said, "Projection precedes protection." Evelyn Drake said, "Compliance buys survival coins." Alex said, "Coins minted from dignity are counterfeit." A wave of murmurs lifted, then broke on the steps below the dais. Lyora Saren said, "There are crimes of action and crimes of story." The room flinched as her words found purchase where the verdict could not. The verdict hung like frost on breath, and the chamber tried to move on as if doom were routine. The narrator measured the space between cruelty and procedure and found it paper thin. Solaris Voss said, "Sentence will be enacted at first cycle." Evelyn Drake said, "Order prevents collapse." Marcus Hale said, "Mercy breeds repetition." Alex said, "Love breeds survival." The gallery rustled, and a few eyes refused the script. Lyora Saren said, "Choose sight over tradition." Alex looked up into the blaze of ships beyond the dome and held still, because endurance is sometimes louder than speech. The narrator followed Alex into memory, where the tribunal's roar thinned into rain on a tin roof. He recalled a kitchen light that hummed and a laugh that bounced off chipped cups. Alex said, "I promise to come back." The promise lived beside scars earned in alleys and deserts where flags changed, but grief did not. Commander Evelyn Drake said, "Obedience saves lives," and the words stuck like sand in his teeth. Dr. Marcus Hale said, "Sacrifice is arithmetic," while he balanced souls on ledgers of steel. Councillor Lyora Saren watched him breathe and measured pain without touching it. Magistrate Solaris Voss said, "Emotion is noise, yet the noise kept Alex standing." The narrator counted heartbeats as if they were witnesses no court could dismiss. The narrator traced the first scar to a convoy ambush where light turned copper and time went thin. Alex said, "Hold the line," and the line became a door that would not open. Evelyn Drake said, "Retreat is strategy, but strategy arrived late and left early." Marcus Hale said, "Truth needs editing," and edited out the names that would not stop whispering. Solaris Voss said, "War writes character, while the dead wrote silence." Lyora Saren said, "Survival is a language you already speak," and he learned to pronounce fear without letting it rule. Alex carried the weight like a lantern, dim yet stubborn. The narrator kept walking because memory refuses to sit when justice is still standing. The narrator opened the door to a ward where the air smelled of iodine and melted rubber. Alex said, "Pain names you," and answered to every name for a while. Evelyn Drake said, "Rehab is war without glory," as machines taught him new limits. Marcus Hale said, "Purpose amputates doubt," and his smile cut like a scalpel. Solaris Voss said, "Fragility proves guilt," and the monitors flickered agreement before settling. Lyora Saren said, "You do not break, you bend," and the bend became posture. Alex learned to stand on a floor that swayed with old explosions. The narrator marked each step as evidence of a verdict that had not yet learned him. The narrator carried him to a training deck where dawn scraped steel and voices snapped. Alex said again, and repetition became a prayer that hurt. Evelyn Drake said, "Discipline is mercy disguised," and he wore it like a second skin. Marcus Hale said, "Data proves resolve," while his charts avoided the cost. Solaris Voss said, "Predictable patterns betray weakness," and cameras blinked like cold insects. Lyora Saren said, "Strength without tenderness is a weapon aimed inward," and her words lingered past the whistle. Alex folded fear into breath until it lay flat enough to step over. The narrator filed the moment, under reasons he did not stay fallen. The narrator returned to the tribunal where memory and present crossed like wires. Alex said, "I am not your arithmetic," and the chamber tasted the spark. Evelyn Drake said, "Choose survival," and her eyes flickered like old film. Marcus Hale said, "Accept the narrative," while edits crawled under his tongue. Solaris Voss said, "Extinction is order," and the word rang like glass. Lyora Saren said, "Endure until the lie tires," and endurance stood taller than rage. Alex thought of a child's laugh, and the way innocence cuts through armor. The narrator understood that the wound was also the window. Through it, hope entered uninvited and refused to leave. The narrator marked the moment the court fed on spectacle and called it proof as towers of footage bled across the air. Magistrate Solaris Voss said, "Observe your lineage of ruin." Alex Mercer said, "Show the hands that saved, not only the fists that failed." Commander Evelyn Drake said, "Context is indulgence." Dr. Marcus Hale said, "Statistics cleanse noise." Councillor Lyora Saren watched patterns, not flames, and her gaze slowed the room. Clips leapt from atrocity to aftermath with seams too neat to be honest. The narrator felt the edit before the blade. Alex said, "Who cut this tapestry, and why do the threads all point one way?" Solaris Voss said, "Direction is judgment." The crowd nodded as if certainty were oxygen. The narrator followed a sequence labeled Mercy Corridor where soldiers fired on evacuees, and the court inhaled outrage. Alex Mercer said, "Overlay thermal and timeline." Solaris Voss said, "You are not permitted tools." Lyora Saren said, "Allow a cross-check." The screen obeyed her voice, and frames staggered like a liar's breath. Marcus Hale said, "Compression artifacts are irrelevant," while his eyes counted risks, not truths. Evelyn Drake said, "Weigh the consequence, not the nuance." A hidden layer surfaced, showing muzzle flashes preceding panic lights by seconds that logic could not excuse. Alex said, "Your holy footage sweats." The chamber shivered because doubt is a draft in a sealed room. The narrator charted a chorus of collaborators who traded love for order and called the bargain wisdom. Commander Evelyn Drake said, "Submission preserves children." Dr. Marcus Hale said, My data predicts collapse without compliance. Alex Mercer said, your models bury names to balance your sums. Solaris Voss said, the arithmetic is pure. Delegates applauded, as if mercy were a rumor. Lyora Saren said, purity is a blade that forgets hands bleed. Alex remembered a ward where strangers shielded strangers for nothing but honor. He said, account for that. The court hesitated because unprofitable courage never fits in ledgers. The narrator saw the first crack widen. The narrator isolated anomalies that hummed like wires behind walls and found dates that argued with shadows. Alex Mercer said, this city fell under rain, yet the smoke lifts like noon. Lyora Saren said, atmospherics disagree. Solaris Voss said, coincidence is abundant. Marcus Hale said, we curate for clarity. And the word curate rang like confession. Evelyn Drake said, precision deters chaos, but her fingers clenched the rail. Frames reversed, metadata blinked, and a signature reappeared where erasure had been. Alex said, someone is sewing a noose from borrowed rope. The chamber's silence sharpened until even certainty felt unsafe to touch. The narrator felt the room recoil as a masked witness feed lit the air with a voice scraped by distance. The figure said, you were never meant to answer, only to absorb blame. Solaris Voss said identity will be traced. The feed trembled and stabilized over a seal from an upper gallery. Mwah. Lyora Saren said, listen to the direction, not the mask. Marcus Hale said, this is disruption, while fear mapped new exits in his eyes. Evelyn Drake said, stand down, but no one moved. Alex Mercer said, name the architect, and the feed cut to black with a single glyph like an eye that would not blink. The narrator knew the game's board at last, but not yet the player's face. The narrator carried Alex into an arena where steel walls pulsed like arteries and judgment arrived as spectacle. Magistrate Solaris Voss said human strength is weakness disguised. Chains fell away and pain became the next gavel. Commander Evelyn Drake said, endurance proves nothing but stubbornness. Dr. Marcus Hale said, collapse will serve as evidence of humanity's futility. Lyora Saren whispered, survive, and truth will surface. Alex Mercer said, I will not break to amuse you. The crowd leaned forward as if cruelty were nourishment. The narrator tasted the air, sharp with ozone and expectation, and knew survival itself was rebellion. The narrator measured time in blows as steel rods cracked against skin and silence demanded witness. Alex Mercer said, each strike writes your fear, not my guilt. Solaris Voss said, pain unmasks illusion. Evelyn Drake said, humanity folds under sustained pressure. Marcus Hale said, prediction confirmed. Limits approach. Lyora Saren said, pain endured is not weakness, it is memory's anchor. The arena shuddered with echoes that became hymns of defiance. Alex knelt once but rose before the echo faded. The narrator marked the crowd's unease as the script faltered. The narrator followed Alex through the trial of fire where walls exhaled heat like furnaces. Solaris Voss said, no species survives unchecked flame. Evelyn Drake said, survival, here is statistical impossibility. Marcus Hale said the data aligns with extinction. Alex Mercer said, I have walked through worse fires named grief. He staggered, clothes smoldering, yet eyes unbroken. Lyora Saren whispered, every step is testimony. The crowd shifted, their certainty cracking like glass. The narrator wrote resilience across the smoke. The narrator revealed the cruelest strike. Betrayal, not by enemies, but by once trusted hands. Dr. Marcus Hale stepped forward and said, justice demands sacrifice, and I chose you long before this day. Alex Mercer said, you were brother, and now you are blade. Evelyn Drake said, allegiance must favor order. Solaris Voss said, even among humans, truth festers. Lyora Saren said, betrayal is fear dressed as wisdom. Alex's chest ached deeper than wounds as trust burned away. The narrator saw the conspiracy unfold like a map inked in blood. The narrator closed the act with Alex chained once more, body ravaged but spirit louder than silence. Solaris Voss said endurance only prolongs inevitability. Marcus Hale said, your suffering validates necessity. Evelyn Drake said, choose submission before the cycle ends. Lyora Saren said, chains cannot silence truth. Alex Mercer said, I endure not for mercy, but for memory of those you fear. The crowd stirred, divided, and in that division the first fracture of power was born. The narrator understood that survival itself was a weapon sharpened against conspiracy. The narrator opened the chamber to fire not of weapons but of words, as Alex Mercer stood bloodied, unbowed, and shackled before the galaxy's gaze. Solaris Voss said, extinction is balance restored. Evelyn Drake said, obedience ensures a fragment survival. Marcus Hale said, mathematics seal your fate. Councillor Lyora Saren said, voices carry longer than chains. Alex Mercer said, you speak of order, yet you fear what you cannot erase. The crowd leaned forward, caught between certainty and unease. The narrator heard the silence before the storm, when truth prepares to speak even through broken lips. The narrator charted the ripple as Alex's voice cut the air with stories older than judgment. Alex said, I have seen fathers fall shielding daughters, and mothers bury sons with songs instead of curses. Solaris Voss said, sentiment is weakness. Evelyn Drake said, emotion clouds calculation. Marcus Hale said, sacrifice cannot alter inevitability. Lyora Saren said, love carves truth sharper than steel. The audience shifted, their breath drawn uneven, as if memory pressed against verdict. The narrator counted each heartbeat as rebellion, a rhythm no gavel could silence. The narrator felt the chamber sway when the truth of lineage rose from Alex's voice, not as plea but revelation. Alex Mercer said, I carry the fire of those who crossed voids before your kind learned to crawl. Solaris Voss said, myth cannot rewrite verdicts. Marcus Hale said, legacy is irrelevant to survival. Evelyn Drake said, the galaxy does not honor heritage, only power. Lyora Saren said, fear of resilience is the true charge here. The crowd stirred, some in anger, others in awe, and the line between witness and participant began to blur. The narrator shuddered as sacrifice entered the stage, not from Alex but from an ally, unseen until now. Councillor Lyora Saren rose and said, if their crime is survival, then count me guilty beside them. Solaris Voss thundered, silence. Evelyn Drake said, your defection confirms humanity's corruption. Marcus Hale said, this is treason against the tribunal. Alex Mercer whispered, you risk everything for us. Lyora Saren said, I risk nothing. Truth risks me. The crowd fractured as uproar swelled, and the first screams for justice drowned the gavel's echo. The narrator crowned the climax as chaos surged, and Alex's voice became fire. Alex Mercer said, we are not asking for mercy. We are demanding recognition. Solaris Voss said, this chamber decides fate, not defiance. Evelyn Drake said, order collapses under rebellion. Marcus Hale said, you gamble with extinction. Lyora Saren said, extinction is already upon those who cannot see truth. The crowd erupted, half crying for humanity's death, half for their freedom. The narrator marked the moment when a single human voice split a galaxy in two. The narrator held the moment the gavel's echo became a riot, and the verdict marched toward blood. Magistrate Solaris Voss said, extermination proceeds at first cycle. Alex Mercer said, you fear what you cannot own. Commander Evelyn Drake said, stability demands closure. Dr. Marcus Hale said, history advances when hesitation dies. Councillor Lyora Saren said, truth will not be carried to the gallows. Gallery tiers fractured as factions shouted, and banners of hard light buckled. The chamber's air tasted of hot metal and old lies. Guards formed a ring as chains tugged Alex toward the execution lift. The narrator watched certainty stumble and spill its mask. Somewhere above, a single glyph blinked like a nerve about to fail. The narrator followed the rupture, as evidence feeds split into competing truths, and the gallery became a tribunal of its own. Lyora Saren said, "Open the archives to every eye." Solaris Voss said, "Authority alone defines verity." Evelyn Drake said, "Contain the breach." Marcus Hale said, "Noise overwhelms, signal." Alex Mercer said, "If vision is yours, why fear witnesses?" Files bloomed midair, timelines misaligned, and ghosts of edits stitched like scars across the reels. Delegates argued past their scripts as doubt colonized their faces. Guards faltered when orders contradicted each other. The narrator felt the scales tilt, not by mercy but by exposure. Even the lights flickered, as if the room learned to blink. The narrator tasted the pivot when a masked transmission punched through the court's veil and named a shadow. The feed said, "Design was never justice, it was containment." Solaris Voss said, "Trace the origin." Evelyn Drake said, "This destabilization serves no one." Marcus Hale whispered, "Impossible." Lyora Saren said, "Follow the seal, not the noise." The glyph widened into a sigil tied to upper governance, and the gallery inhaled like a single lung. Alex Mercer said, "Name the hand that writes the rote." The feed flashed a crest, linked to Regent Orion Vale, and then collapsed. The chamber roared because fear had found a face. The narrator wrote revelation in letters that would not wash off. The narrator walked beside Alex as the execution lift rose like a slow verdict, and the galaxy leaned in. Solaris Voss said, "Proceed and restore balance." Evelyn Drake said, "Order requires conclusion," yet her gaze slipped toward the howling tears. Marcus Hale said, "A swift end prevents contagion." Lyora Saren said, "Endings cannot strangle beginnings forever." Alex Mercer said, "You can kill a throat, not a truth." The lift halted as failsafes argued with new commands, and a child's hologram flickered into the air. Maya Mercer laughed once, then looked broken, and every voice in the hall remembered someone they had loved. The narrator felt the blade of innocence cut through armor no weapon could pierce. The narrator closed the resolution with a verdict that refused simplicity and a future written in watchfulness. Solaris Voss said, "Extermination is rescinded under sanction." Evelyn Drake said, "Survival will be supervised." Marcus Hale said, "Compliance will define terms." Lyora Saren said, "Let surveillance learn compassion." Alex Mercer said, "We will live, scarred and seen." The gallery's fury sank into a stunned hush as banners dimmed and chains fell like tired comets. Outside, fleets held position like teeth that had decided not to bite. The narrator watched Alex step down, each footprint a debt the galaxy now owed. Hope did not cheer, it endured. The narrator walked beside Alex as the tribunal emptied, and the roar collapsed into dust. Solaris Voss said, "You leave alive but not unobserved." Evelyn Drake said, "Supervision preserves stability." Marcus Hale said, "History records compliance." Lyora Saren said, "Walk anyway." Alex Mercer said, "Living under sight is still living." The corridors smelled of ion and old oaths, and the banners dimmed like tired stars. Outside the dome, fleets hovered like thoughts waiting to harden. The narrator understood that survival is a road paved with eyes. The narrator paused in a quiet antechamber where light pooled like mercy that refused to speak its name. Lyora Saren said, "Your endurance opened a door." Alex Mercer said, "Doors can also be cages." Lyora Saren said, "Then treat the bars as windows." Evelyn Drake's orders echoed faint beyond the wall like marching thoughts. Marcus Hale said, "Terms will arrive by cycle's end." Alex said, "So will truth." The room held stillness, the way a wound holds a lesson. The narrator knew gratitude could not erase the bruise, but it could name it. The narrator watched authority arrive wrapped in civility as Evelyn Drake and Marcus Hale stood with papers that smelled of iron. Evelyn Drake said, "Conditions ensure peace." Marcus Hale said, "Deviations invite correction." Alex Mercer said, "Control in new clothes." Lyora Saren said, "Balance demands more than threat." Solaris Voss said, "Observation will be constant." Alex said, "Then you will see what you feared." The hall's lights flickered like doubt learning to breathe. The narrator marked the signatures that could not bind a spine. The narrator led them to the viewport where the fleets waited like winter. Regent Orion Vale watched from a high gallery as if patience were a blade. "Orion Vale," said, "survival buys time, nothing more." Evelyn Drake said, "Time is leverage." Marcus Hale said, "Leverage becomes order." Lyora Saren said, "Time also grows truth." Alex Mercer said, "We will spend it on becoming worth the fear you hold." The void answered with silence that felt like a promise neither side trusted. The narrator understood that vigilance would be the price of breath. The narrator closed on a corridor where footsteps sounded like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. Lyora Saren said, "Your path will be watched." Alex Mercer said, "So let them watch." Evelyn Drake said, "Any breach ends the reprieve." Marcus Hale said, "I will be there to measure it." Solaris Voss said, "History will judge this mercy." Alex stopped, looked into a memory of Maya's eyes, and breathed. Alex said, "They wanted a verdict. What they got was a warning." The corridor held the words as if they were a map.